I never thought I'd be the kind of person to end up in a war with a homeowners association. Honestly, I moved out here to avoid that kind of drama. After 35 years working in government, most of it in agricultural enforcement and food policy, all I wanted was peace. A little land, a little fruit, a quiet place where no one knew my name, and I could let the apples do the talking. That was the dream. And for the first 3 years, it was everything I hoped for. Just me, a worn-down but sturdy farmhouse, and 52 trees that bore the most stubborn, sun-soaked apples this side of the county. My name is Joseph Langley. I'm a widower, a grandfather, and a retired director of the State Agricultural Enforcement Division. But out here in Valley Glen, I was just Joe with the apples. No one asked me where I'd come from. No one seemed to care. And I liked it that way. I bought the parcel on the eastern edge of the neighborhood, not technically inside the HOA lines, but close enough to be visible from their walking trails. The land was a bit of a mess when I found it. Overgrown, scattered with rusted-out junk and feral dogs, the previous owner had clearly given up on it years ago. But I saw potential. The soil was good, the water table stable, and the old irrigation lines just needed some love. So I rolled up my sleeves, literally, and I spent that first year clearing, planting, pruning, digging. It was therapy I didn't know I needed. By year 2, the orchard had taken shape. Kids from the nearby elementary school would come by with teachers and sketchbooks sitting under the trees and drawing bees and blossoms. I built a little stand at the edge of the road, not for business, really. Just a table with a sign that said, "Pay what you want. Take what you need." Most folks left a few bucks in the jar. Some left thank you notes. Once someone left a jar of their own peach jam with a note that read, "You give apples, I give peaches." It was that kind of neighborhood, or so I thought. I didn't have any illusions about being part of the HOA. My land wasn't technically within their jurisdiction, and I had no interest in dealing with their board. I'd seen enough HOA horror stories during my years in policy overreach, abusive power, weaponized bylaws. I wanted no part of that. I stayed out of their meetings, never voted, and never asked for their help. I figured that was enough to keep me out of their sights. But then she showed up. Her name was Karen Bishop, blonde, sharp-shouldered, and always dressed like she was about to film a reality TV show about high-maintenance suburban life. She moved into the neighborhood sometime in early spring. I only noticed because she started walking her tiny white dog past my orchard every morning, always staring, always frowning. At first, I didn't think much of it. Not everyone likes the smell of compost or the sight of a weather-beaten tractor. But by mid-April, I started getting strange letters. Not from the city, not from the county, but from the Valley Glen Homeowners Association, addressed to the occupant. The first one was passive-aggressive. Your property has drawn multiple concerns regarding visual inconsistency with the community's aesthetic values. I snorted, tossed it in the trash, and kept pruning my trees. Then came another. We've noticed the display of produce sales activity. Please be aware that commercial operations are not permitted within or adjacent to HOA lines. That one made me pause. I knew my rights. I knew the parcel lines. I knew the local ag codes and the state rural commerce exemptions. I had written them after all. And technically, my land was ag exempt and pre-zoned for low-impact retail as long as it didn't involve permanent structures or heavy foot traffic. A pay-what-you-can apple stand with no signage, and no employees didn't even come close to violating anything. But I also knew this was only the beginning. A week later, Karen came by in person. No greeting, no introduction. She didn't even walk through the gate, just stood at the edge of my gravel drive with arms crossed and said, "You need to remove that fruit stand. It's an eyesore. You're lowering property values." I looked up from the crates I was sorting, sweat on my brow, a sun hat on my head. "Good morning to you too," I said calmly. She didn't laugh. "This is a residential area," she snapped. "If you want to play farmer, go do it in the actual country, not next to families trying to raise children." "I'm not playing anything," I replied. "This land has been zoned agricultural since 1964. I'm not selling to grocery chains. I'm not parking food trucks. I'm just sharing apples." "That may be," she said coldly, "but the HOA has rules, and we intend to enforce them." That was the moment I knew she wouldn't stop. Some people build power by leading, others by helping. But people like Karen, they build power by controlling. And when they can't control something, they make it a threat. I didn't react, not then. I smiled, tipped my hat, and walked back to my crates. She stood there a while longer, clearly annoyed I hadn't responded with fear or apology. Eventually, she turned and walked away. I figured maybe that would be the end of it. Maybe she just needed to vent. Maybe she'd move on to someone else who forgot to trim their hedges, or parked a boat in the driveway. But in my gut, I felt the storm building. People like Karen didn't let go once they set their eyes on something. And I was starting to feel her gaze like a tightening noose. A week after that tense standoff at the gate, I received a thick envelope in the mail, not from the city, not even from a law office, but from the Valley Glen HOA Compliance Committee. The header was unnecessarily official-looking with gold script and a poorly printed seal that tried too hard to mimic some kind of government legitimacy. Inside were 6 printed pages, stapled crookedly together, filled with dense paragraphs of language meant to sound legal, but to anyone who's actually worked in regulation, it read like a bad student trying to impress a professor with too many adjectives. The core of it was this: I was allegedly violating Article 7, Section B of the HOA covenant regarding adjacent land compliance. The document claimed my orchard constituted unapproved commercial activity within visible proximity of community property, and that I had 21 days to cease operations, remove any structures related to the selling of goods, and attend a compliance hearing or face formal action. I read the letter twice, then I laughed, out loud. It was a sad, frustrated laugh, not because I thought they were right, but because I knew exactly what they were doing. I'd seen this playbook 100 times in my former life. You create a long, intimidating document full of misquoted policies and half-baked logic, hoping the recipient gets scared enough to comply. You rely on their confusion, on their lack of legal understanding. It's about bluffing about power through language. And to someone who didn't know better, it would have been scary. Too bad I wasn't someone who didn't know better. I made a cup of coffee, sat on the porch, and flipped through my old files. I still had my copies of the county zoning maps, along with the grandfathered land use permits for properties in my area. I found my parcel number, traced the boundaries, and confirmed, as I already knew, that not a square inch of my land was under HOA jurisdiction. In fact, the only reason they could even see my orchard was because their landscapers had cut down a row of buffer trees a few years back to make way for their walking trail. That evening, I sent them a short letter in response. Simple, direct, and written in the kind of dry, bureaucratic language that makes petty people sweat. To whom it may concern. Your recent communication dated X references Article 7, Section B of the Valley Glen HOA Covenant in regard to my property at parcel by 1982-03C. I must inform you that said parcel exists wholly outside of HOA-governed jurisdiction, as defined by the recorded plat maps filed with the county assessor's office. Furthermore, the agricultural activity conducted on my land falls under State Statute 47-113, subsection A, which provides for non-commercial community-driven distribution of produce grown on personal agricultural parcels. Any further attempt to regulate, fine, or otherwise interfere with activities conducted within my legal property boundaries will be considered harassment. Regards, Joseph Langley. I didn't hear back for 4 days. Then the letters resumed, not from the HOA this time, but from concerned residents of Valley Glen, which, judging by the identical font and formatting, was just Karen with a new hat on. The flyers were slipped under my gate. Printed in bold red ink were phrases like devaluing our homes, and strangers at the orchard stand, and is our neighborhood safe anymore? That last one hit a nerve. Safe. The kids who came to pick apples with their grandparents, the teachers who brought their second graders to learn how pollination works, the elderly couple who brought a blanket and books every Sunday to sit under the Macintosh tree. What exactly was unsafe? Was it the laughter, the scent of cider I occasionally brewed in my garage for fall events? Or was it simply that I didn't ask permission to exist? Karen wasn't just trying to silence my orchard. She was trying to manufacture a narrative that I was some kind of looming threat, a rogue element, spoiling her curated suburban fantasy. And the worst part, a few people were starting to believe her. One morning, I noticed a neighbor I'd spoken to several times, a quiet woman named Ruth, who used to buy apples for her pies, hurried past without waving. 2 days later, the local church group that held a bake sale on the corner near my trees canceled without explanation. I felt the shift. The warmth that had once surrounded this place was now tinged with suspicion, with watching. Then the cameras started showing up. Not official surveillance, not yet, but tiny ones. I found a small motion sensor camera, zip-tied to the walking trail fence, pointing directly into my orchard. Another appeared on a HOA-owned lamppost, angled toward the entrance to my dirt drive. When I asked the HOA about them, they said they were for wildlife tracking and neighborhood safety. When I removed one, a letter arrived warning me not to interfere with HOA installations. I started documenting everything. Every flyer, every letter, every interaction. I kept a journal. I printed photos of the cameras. I even spoke to a friend of mine from my former department who now worked in local code enforcement. She confirmed that Karen had submitted multiple anonymous complaints about my unauthorized food service operations and soil runoff endangering neighborhood trails. So now I was a biological threat. I could feel the frustration building, but I didn't lash out. That's what they wanted. A reaction. An excuse. I kept tending my trees, welcoming the families that still came, smiling at the ones who didn't. I kept being exactly who I was. And that, I think, infuriated Karen even more, which led to the incident that changed everything. It was a Thursday morning in early October, just after the first real chill had crept into the air. I was stacking crates of Golden Delicious, ready for a group of third graders from the local elementary school. They were due to arrive with 2 teachers and a few parents. We'd planned a small tour, nothing fancy. Just a little walk among the rows, a story about bees, a tasting, and then they'd go home with a bag of apples each. But just as the school bus rolled up, lights flashing, kids buzzing, 2 police cruisers pulled in behind them. Blue and red lights swirled through the orchard, painting the leaves in strange, stuttering colors. I knew immediately who had called. Karen stood near the fence arms, folded phone still in hand, with that smug, nauseating smirk of someone who thought she'd finally got him. I didn't move. The kids were still on the bus. The officers stepped out slowly, their hands near their belts, but not on their weapons. "Sir," one of them called. "We've had a report of unauthorized commercial activity involving minors. Mind if we talk?" I looked at the kids' excited faces pressed to the windows, at the bags of apples waiting by the shed, and at the orchard I had poured my soul into. Then I turned to the officer and said calmly, "Sure, officer. But before we begin, you might want to run my name." The officer raised an eyebrow as he pulled a small notepad from his vest pocket and asked, "Your name, sir?" I answered evenly, "Joseph Langley." He paused, then glanced at his partner, who already had his tablet out. A few taps later, his partner's eyes widened ever so slightly. Then he looked up at me, with a sharp breath through his nose, and I knew they had found it. The senior officer turned slightly, voice now quieter. "Mr. Langley, is it true you were with the State Agricultural Enforcement Division?" I nodded once. "Director retired. I served for 22 years. There was a long beat of silence before he said, "I think we need to take this offline." I motioned for us to step away from the bus, out of earshot from the children and their teachers, who still hadn't disembarked. Karen was still lingering by the trailhead, pretending to adjust her scarf, but very much eavesdropping. We moved to the side of my barn, where the officer rubbed the back of his neck. "Sir, I'll be honest with you. We got a call saying you were conducting an unlicensed agricultural event, inviting school children to participate in what was described as unregulated produce harvesting with no health permits and potential exposure to contaminated soil." I let out a slow breath, the kind that's part laugh, part disbelief. "Contaminated soil," I echoed. "We're talking about children picking apples off the tree." He nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "Yeah, I figured as much. But procedure says we check it out. Your name? Well, it's known. I took one class under your division back in academy, back in 2010. Soil safety protocols. I still remember the checklist. I couldn't help but smile. Then you also know," I said gently, "that there's nothing illegal happening here. These apples have passed lab testing. The farm is grandfathered in under both the County Agricultural Exemption and the Rural Education Use Act. No sales, no chemicals, just kids learning where their food comes from." He nodded again. "I believe you, sir. But just to make it official, would you mind showing me your documents?" I had already prepared them. They were in a thick folder in the farmhouse kitchen just inside. As I walked back across the gravel, I could feel Karen's eyes burning into my back. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. I came back out with the binder and handed it to the officer. He and his partner took their time flipping through it, not rushing, but not skeptical either. I could tell from their posture that they were starting to feel played. When they were done, the senior officer snapped it shut. "Everything looks good. You're in the clear. Sorry for the inconvenience." "No problem," I said, watching the officers walk back to their vehicles. But Karen, she wasn't done. She marched up, righteous and loud, blocking the officer before he could get into his cruiser. "Are you just going to let him do this?" She shouted loud enough for the kids on the bus to start peering out again. "There are children here. This is a hazard. He doesn't even have a vendor's permit. This is a business, not a home." The officer held up his hand. "Ma'am, calm down. There's no violation here. Mr. Langley is within his rights, but he's bringing strangers into the community. Our HOA has clear guidelines." "With respect, ma'am," the officer cut in, clearly tired, "this property is not under HOA jurisdiction. You have no authority here." Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at me, looked for the first time, as if seeing a ghost of something she didn't quite understand. "You don't know who he is, do you?" the officer said, half smiling now. "Mr. Langley isn't just some guy with apples. He wrote half the ag code for this county. He trained our department on rural land use enforcement for years. You're barking up the wrong tree." Karen's face turned crimson. Her hand clutched the leash of her dog so tightly that the little thing yipped. She stepped back but didn't say another word. The school bus doors finally opened. A teacher stepped down, her eyes darting nervously between the police and Karen. I gave her a warm smile and waved. "It's all right," I said. "We're ready for you." The kids filed out slowly at first, but the moment they stepped into the orchard, their nervous energy dissolved into laughter. A few parents came, and within minutes, the place felt like it always did, full of life, innocence, and the scent of fall. Karen stood at the edge of the trail, frozen. She looked like she wanted to scream, like she needed the world to bend to her will. But for once it didn't. No one looked to her for guidance. No one echoed her outrage. The cops got into their cruisers and left. The kids picked apples. The parents took photos. The orchard was alive, and she was irrelevant. And that, I believe, was the real crime in her mind. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of warm cider. The trees rustled gently in the evening breeze. My dog Scout rested at my feet, and the moonlight filtered through the branches in soft silver waves. I should have felt victorious. In a way, I did. But I also knew this wasn't over. People like Karen didn't retreat, they regrouped. The look in her eyes that day told me she wasn't finished. I had embarrassed her. I had shattered the illusion of control she thought she had. She'd be back. And next time, she wouldn't just come with flyers or cameras. She'd come with the full weight of the HOA behind her. It happened 2 weeks later, early on a Saturday morning when the air was crisp and the orchard was just beginning to blush with autumn. I'd been out at dawn harvesting a few baskets of Honeycrisp for a local food pantry. As I loaded crates into the truck bed, I heard the familiar crunch of tires on gravel, but not the slow, casual roll of a neighbor or friend. This was faster, purposeful. 2 squad cars pulled up, lights off, but unmistakably official. I put down my gloves, brushed my hands on my jeans, and stood upright. This time, it wasn't the same officers. 2 new faces stepped out, younger, less relaxed. One of them looked fresh out of academy, still adjusting his belt like it didn't quite fit. The other, tall, sharp-jawed, trying too hard to project authority, approached with a clipboard in hand. "Mr. Langley," the younger one asked, already scanning my crates like they held contraband. "That's me," I replied, nodding. "Can I help you, officers?" The taller one didn't waste time. "We've received a report of ongoing unlicensed food distribution and unauthorized commercial operations. We're here to issue a citation and conduct an inspection of the premises." My stomach tightened, not from fear, but from that familiar wave of indignation that rises when someone abuses process for personal agendas. I'd seen this tactic used on immigrant farmers, roadside flower sellers, even lemonade stands. Weaponized policy. Bureaucratic theater designed to intimidate. By whose authority, I asked. "This action falls under the county health department's temporary enforcement mandate," the tall one replied, "per Executive Order 17A. We're empowered to enforce food safety compliance in suspected non-compliant locations. I folded my arms. And where's the health inspector? The younger officer glanced down flustered. Ma'am Bishop filed the report. We were told to document and record. Karen, of course. From behind the trees, I spotted her silhouette again, just far enough down the HOA trail to pretend she was walking her dog, but close enough to enjoy the show. She was recording, phone in hand, eyes locked on me like a hawk, waiting for its prey to twitch. I sighed, trying to keep my voice level. Officers, I appreciate your diligence, but I've already provided documentation to this department regarding the exempt status of this land under County Agricultural Code 4.13b. Furthermore, I've been advised by your department's own legal liaison officer, Reyes, that any inspection must be accompanied by a certified agent from the health division with proper cause. The younger cop blinked. You spoke to Reyes. The tall one frowned. That's above our level, sir. I know, I said. That's why you're here. You were sent, not informed. He didn't respond, but his posture shifted, not defensive, not yet hostile, but uncertain. He realized, as many do, that I wasn't just an old man with baskets of apples. I was someone who knew the system better than the people trying to manipulate it. Still, they proceeded. We'll need to see inside your structures, the tall one continued. Shed storage, possibly your kitchen, any area used for food preparation. You got a warrant, I asked. There was a long pause. No, the younger one admitted. Then, you're not seeing anything, I said gently. And if you persist, I'll have no choice but to call County Supervisor Dean directly. She's aware of the situation here, and she knows exactly what kind of complaints have been filed and why. The younger officer took a step back. The tall one stared at me hard, trying to assert dominance, trying to find a chink in the calm. Behind him, I heard Karen yelling, "What are you doing? You're just going to let him get away with this again. This is a disgrace. He's poisoning the neighborhood. He's a fraud." I looked past the officers toward her, and for the first time, I walked closer to the HOA trail. Close enough to speak clearly without raising my voice. "Karen," I said firmly, "you're trespassing again. If you take one more step onto this property, I'll call the sheriff and file a restraining order." She laughed, but it was brittle. "You think anyone cares about your apples? You think this town will back you once they see who you really are?" I raised an eyebrow. "You mean once they remember that I helped draft the Soil Protection Act that saved half this valley from drought 10 years ago? Or the Rural Produce Exemption Law that made it possible for low-income farmers to sell without drowning in red tape, that who I really am?" Her face drained of color. For the first time, I saw genuine fear behind her bravado. Because she hadn't just poked the bear. She'd poked someone who'd built the den. The officers turned. "Ma'am," the younger one called, "we've handled it. Please return to your property." She hesitated. Then she muttered something and stormed off, leash pulled taut, high heels snapping against the pavement like punctuation marks on a tantrum. The moment she disappeared down the trail, the taller officer stepped aside and handed me a citation form unsigned. "Just protocol," he mumbled. "We won't be filing it, but we had to deliver it." I nodded, accepting the paper, and as they turned to leave, I said quietly, "Next time, tell your supervisor I'm happy to provide a seminar on property rights." The younger one cracked a smile as he slid into the cruiser. After they drove off, I sat back down on the tailgate of my truck, surrounded by apples crates and the quiet rustle of leaves. The kids hadn't come today. Karen had probably intercepted them through the school board. The orchard was still, but not defeated. She was escalating, that much was clear. And while she might have had the HOA a few rookie cops and a bitter grudge, I had something far more dangerous. I had time. I had truth. And I had every piece of paper that proved she was wrong. The war had begun. But I wasn't fighting it with fists or noise. I was fighting it the way I always had, one documented lie at a time. The next morning, I was sipping my coffee on the porch, watching a few blue jays dance between the trees, when a beat-up gray pickup pulled into the gravel drive. It was James Tolley, one of the few remaining original residents of Valley Glen, before the HOA bulldozed its way into the area, with promises of beautification and property value enhancement. He climbed out slowly, his knees stiff from years in the oil fields, and gave me a short wave. "Joe," he said, "you got a minute?" "Always do," I replied, setting my mug down and motioning to the second chair. He didn't sit. Instead, he handed me a crumpled flyer, the same kind that had been making its way into mailboxes around the neighborhood. But this one had a new headline printed in bold red across the top. Joseph Langley exposed who's really running the Apple farm. Below it was a grainy photo of me from years ago, likely pulled from some obscure press release or internal government bulletin. The write-up that followed was a twisted distortion of my background, painting me as some kind of embedded operative, trying to circumvent local control, insinuating that I had ties to secret lobbying efforts and backroom deals. None of it true, of course. Just enough truth adjacent to make it sound plausible. She passed these out at the HOA board meeting last night. James muttered disgust thick in his voice. Told everyone you were here to exploit a loophole and turn the neighborhood into a produce hub for government experimentation. I let out a short breath, half laughter, half disbelief. She really said that. He nodded. And when Marlene asked her where she got the info, she waved her phone and said, "It's all public record. Do your research." The anger in my chest didn't rise the way it used to. I was past that. Karen wasn't dangerous because of her intelligence. She was dangerous because of her ability to manufacture fear. And fear, as I knew well from decades in state enforcement, didn't need truth to spread. It just needed a crack. "She's rattled," I said quietly. That last incident didn't go the way she wanted. James looked around, then finally sat. "Joe, you need to know something else. She's talking to the new HOA president, Kyle Mendez. Young guy. Moved in last year. Tech startup money. Doesn't care about history or law. He's hungry to prove himself, and Karen's feeding him nonsense about cleaning up the perimeter. He's proposing a bylaw that would give the HOA more say over adjacent lands for visual cohesion, which they can't do," I said immediately. "State law is clear. HOA jurisdiction ends at the plat boundary. They'd have to petition the county for annexation, and even then, it would be non-binding without my consent." "Yeah," James said. "But most people don't understand that. If he makes enough noise, people might start to think they have a right to regulate you. That's the danger." I nodded slowly. Then it's time I remind them who I am. That night, I pulled down a dusty metal lockbox from the top shelf in my study. Inside were documents I hadn't looked at in years. Official letters, commendations, legislative drafts with my annotations still penciled in the margins. I flipped through them not for nostalgia, but to gather receipts. I printed copies, compiled a binder, and the next day, I went to the HOA meeting. I'd never attended one before, not once. But when I stepped through the doors of the community rec hall wearing my old navy blue jacket, the one with the silver pin from my time with the State Ag Enforcement Council, all eyes turned to me. Karen was at the podium mid-sentence, her voice sharp with conviction. "And we must remain vigilant against misuse of adjacent lands. We cannot allow unregulated spaces to compromise our community standards." She froze mid-breath when she saw me. Her lips curled, but she forced a smile. "Oh," she said into the microphone, "Mr. Langley. How nice of you to join us. Did you come to clarify some of the concerns residents have raised?" I walked to the front, slow and steady, carrying the binder. No rush, no aggression, just gravity. "I did," I said, taking the microphone from its stand with calm familiarity. "And I appreciate the opportunity." For the next 5 minutes, I laid out my credentials not to boast, but to educate. I told them about my years as Director of Agricultural Enforcement, my role in drafting land use exemptions for community growers, my position on the Clean Soil Preservation Task Force. I explained in layman's terms exactly how my land was protected, not because I was someone important, but because the law was clear. Then I opened the binder and passed out copies to each board member. Pages showing land maps, exemption codes, correspondence with the county, and a notarized letter from the supervisor's office affirming my legal rights to operate as I had. "If you attempt to pass this new bylaw," I said plainly, "you will be in violation of state statutes. And if you try to enforce it against me or anyone else in similar standing, I will have no choice but to file an injunction. Not because I want to fight, but because I won't let misinformation become policy." A hush fell across the room. Karen looked stunned, not by the content, but by the fact that her weapon had been turned on her. The truth wielded with precision was something she couldn't shout over. Kyle Mendez, the young president, flipped through the pages with increasing concern. "I wasn't aware of most of this," he admitted, pushing his glasses up. "Karen said you were just a retired farmer." I smiled politely. "I am. But before that, I was one of the people who wrote the book you're now trying to rewrite." He didn't speak after that. The motion was tabled. The meeting ended early. Karen left without a word. As I walked back to my truck under the warm flicker of streetlights, several residence people I hadn't spoken to in months stopped me just to say thank you. One man handed me a folded note with a simple message. "You stood up without raising your voice. That's rare." I tucked the note into my coat pocket. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt ready, because I knew Karen wasn't done. This wasn't just about apples anymore. It was about principle, and I had a few more chapters left to write. After the HOA meeting, word spread fast, not just in Valley Glen, but across the township. The moment I walked into the hardware store that week, the clerk, a college kid named Richie, who never used to say more than paper or plastic, raised his hand in a sort of salute and said, "Respect, Mr. Langley." I chuckled, waved him off, and walked to the irrigation fittings aisle. I didn't want notoriety. I didn't want to be the guy people whispered about at coffee shops. But when someone tries to strip away your dignity, sometimes the only way to reclaim it is to stand tall in front of everyone and remind them you've been here before and you're not afraid to go again. Back at the orchard, the change was immediate. People who'd kept their distance began drifting back. Miss Ruth brought over a peach cobbler. The church group came by to reschedule their bake sale. Parents from the elementary school sent handwritten letters thanking me for the apple day and apologizing for being misled by neighborhood rumors. They didn't mention Karen by name. They didn't have to. But just when I thought the tide was turning, the next move arrived, this time with real teeth. I got a call from the county recorder's office. "Mr. Langley, we're reaching out because there's been a request to review the status of your land's exemptions," the woman said. "The petition cites suspected zoning misclassification and requests a formal compliance reassessment." I blinked. Who filed the petition? There was a pause on the line. It was submitted by the Valley Glen Homeowners Association. There it was. Their next tactic: question the system itself. If they couldn't defeat me with bylaws or scare tactics, they'd try to unravel the framework I stood on brick by brick. I thanked her, hung up, and sat at the kitchen table for a long while, staring at the wall where an old photograph of my wife hung. Sandra had passed 7 years ago. Cancer sudden and brutal. She would have told me to fight smart, not hard. She always said, if they use chaos, you use structure. So I did. That afternoon, I sent an email to a former colleague of mine, Dr. Laura Mendel, now head of the State Agricultural Oversight Committee. We'd worked together on multiple food safety initiatives and land use audits. She responded within the hour. By the end of the week, I had a letter on official state letterhead reaffirming that my land had been inspected, grandfathered, and approved under 4 separate statutes. She also offered to testify on my behalf if needed. But I didn't stop there. I gathered all the documentation I'd given the HOA, the same packet I'd passed out at the meeting, and sent copies to the county clerk's office, the planning commission, and the local newspaper editor. Not to make a scene, but to set the record, publicly, permanently. And then I filed something Karen hadn't seen coming, a Freedom of Information Act request to the HOA itself. It's a little-known quirk in our state law. Any HOA that collects dues and enforces covenants under a mandatory membership model is subject to limited transparency requirements. That includes disclosure of meeting minutes, voting records, and correspondence related to enforcement actions. 2 weeks later, a brown envelope showed up in my mailbox. Inside 28 pages of internal communications, emails, notes, draft agendas, and most damning, a message from Karen to the new president, Kyle, with the subject line, "He's bluffing. No one will check the codes." She had even attached a mock-up of a neighborhood petition flyer. One paragraph read, "We can say his soil has runoff. People will believe anything with the word contamination." I sat there stunned, feeling a quiet fury build in my chest. This wasn't just overreach. This was fabrication, targeted misinformation. And worse, it was weaponizing fear for control. I made 2 calls. First to the State Department of Housing and Community Development, filing a formal complaint for HOA misconduct and regulatory harassment. Second to a journalist. I trusted Simone Keller, the same reporter who'd covered our Clean Water Initiative years ago. She had a reputation for taking on stories others were too nervous to touch. I forwarded her the documents and gave her everything. She called me that night. "Joe," she said, "you're sitting on a powder keg, and I want to light the fuse." "I don't want revenge," I told her. "Just truth and sunlight." She promised me both. A week later, her article dropped. Fruit of the fight: how one orchard owner is standing up to HOA tyranny. It went viral within a day. The headline was shared across community groups, veterans pages, sustainable farming forums. People from all over the state began emailing me, some thanking me, some sharing similar stories of abuse by HOAs. One letter simply said, "Thank you for reminding us that the law is for everyone, not just the loudest." Karen. She went silent. No flyers. No calls to the sheriff. No surprise inspections. Instead, whispers began floating around Valley Glen that Karen's position on the board was being reconsidered, that Kyle was stepping back, that the HOA had received a notice of pending audit from the state. At night, I would sit on the porch again, like I used to, cider in hand, Scout curled up by my feet. The orchard rustled gently under the stars. The apples were nearly ready for their last big harvest of the season. I had never raised my voice. I had never pushed back with anger or fire. But I had something stronger. I had structure. I had clarity. I had the kind of authority that couldn't be shouted down or rewritten by a petty flyer. Karen may have thought she was fighting a farmer. She didn't realize she was up against the very system she thought she could manipulate. And for the first time in weeks, I exhaled fully. Not because it was over, but because I knew without question I had the upper hand now. With the article making its rounds, I expected the HOA to back off and lick its wounds quietly. I was wrong. They didn't retreat. They regrouped, and this time they tried to come across as reasonable. 3 days after the story went public, I received an unexpected invitation. Hand-delivered cream-colored envelope with the HOA crest printed in gold at the top. Dear Mr. Langley, in the interest of mutual understanding and community cohesion, the Valley Glen Homeowners Association formally invites you to a mediation session to discuss potential compromises regarding property aesthetics and community alignment. Sincerely, Kyle Mendez, President, Valley Glen HOA. There were no threats, no citations, just sugar-coated diplomacy from a board that had spent months trying to ruin me. I could see Karen's fingerprints all over it. Mediation. It was a tactic, not an olive branch, a performative show of reason designed to create the illusion that I was the difficult one if I refused. But I didn't refuse. I accepted on one condition: that the session be open to the public. Their response was swift and negative, so I declined. Instead, I sent them a formal letter of my own citing recent actions by their board as grounds for regulatory harassment, false accusations, and attempted manipulation of local zoning enforcement. I copied the letter to 3 entities. 1. The County Office of Land Use and Compliance. 2. The Office of the State Attorney General. 3. The County Board of Supervisors. That same day, I also filed a motion of public inquiry with the County Planning Board. It was a legal step that forced the HOA to respond to my land status dispute under official scrutiny, with all their claims and counterclaims now part of the public record. This wasn't vengeance. It was accountability. And it worked. Within 2 weeks, the county called for a public hearing scheduled for the town hall. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the HOA's attempts to exert control outside its legal reach. The night of the hearing, I arrived 15 minutes early. The room was already full. Fold-out chairs lined every wall. Teachers, farmers, veterans, parents, a few folks I hadn't seen since Sandra's funeral. Even Pastor Hal from the little white church by the bridge was there, sitting with his Bible tucked into his coat. Karen was seated 2 rows from the front, arms folded, her mouth pressed into a bitter line. Kyle sat beside her, flipping through a folder, looking like a kid rehearsing lines for a school play. When my name was called, I stepped to the podium with the same binder I'd carried weeks earlier. The documents hadn't changed, but the weight behind them had. I spoke clearly without notes. I'm here not because I want to fight my neighbors, but because I've been left with no other choice. I've been accused, surveilled, harassed, and slandered by an entity that has no legal jurisdiction over my land, my crops, or my life. The HOA has attempted to create the appearance of non-compliance where none exists. And worse, they've tried to use fear to turn neighbors into enemies. A murmur of agreement rippled behind me. I opened the binder, passed a few new documents to the panel. Letters of support, independent soil and zoning surveys, the FOIA emails, Karen's own words. I paused and turned to the audience. Let me be clear, this was never about apples. It was about control, about power, and about what happens when people are too afraid to stand up to it. The room fell into silence. Then came applause, gentle at first, then louder. When the panel moved on, Karen stood and requested to speak. Permission granted. She walked slowly to the microphone, her heels clicking like defiance. Her voice was low, icy. Mr. Langley has positioned himself as a victim, but let's not forget that rules exist for a reason. Neighborhood cohesion depends on predictability, order. If we allow one person to operate freely, it sets a precedent that undermines the very structure that keeps our community safe. A few heads nodded, but more people shifted uncomfortably. Is it about safety? Someone whispered behind me, or about being in charge? The chairwoman of the hearing raised a hand. Ms. Bishop, we have reviewed your submitted documentation. None of it provides legal standing for your claims. Additionally, your correspondence contains language we find concerning. You are advised to cease any further unapproved surveillance or public commentary directed at Mr. Langley pending final review. Karen's face paled. When the hearing adjourned, people flooded into the lobby, not to argue, but to thank me. One woman brought her son, a quiet kid, who'd visited the orchard on a field trip. He handed me a drawing he'd made a crooked apple tree with the words, Mr. Joe's Place, the real safe spot, scribbled in blue crayon at the bottom. That one hit me harder than anything else. The next day, I received a letter in the mail, not from the HOA, from Kyle. A personal note scrawled in nervous handwriting. Mr. Langley, I realize now how much I misunderstood the situation. Karen made it seem like you were exploiting the system, but that's not true. I see that now. I've called an emergency vote to remove her from the board. I'm sorry, Kyle Mendez. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even surprising. Because once truth takes root, it grows fast. And the roots under my orchard ran deep. Karen was removed by a 6-1 vote. Her resignation was announced via a flat, forgettable email the following Monday. No farewell speech, no defense, just silence. A silence that for once felt good. The day after Karen's resignation was announced, I went out to the orchard early, just as the sun was breaking over the tree line. The light was golden and quiet, the kind that softens everything it touches. I remember standing there, my hand resting on the old wooden gate, thinking, it's finally over. But it wasn't. Not in the way I expected. The war was done, yes. But now came the aftermath, and with it something far more unexpected, community. They started trickling in by mid-morning. First it was just Ruth, with her peach pies again. She left them on the porch with a note that read, for the man who remembered what neighbor used to mean. Then came the elementary school teacher, Miss Alston, with 3 students in tow holding handmade signs. We love Joe's apples and our favorite field trip ever. And then waves. A group of veterans from the local American Legion arrived the next afternoon. They'd read the article and wanted to meet the old man who fought a HOA. The way we used to fight battles, smart, quiet, and precise. We sat under the trees that day, swapping stories, laughing, sharing cider. They asked if they could use the orchard for a picnic in November. I said yes, without blinking. Within a week, I received so many letters, emails, and calls that I had to clear off my entire kitchen table just to sort through the stacks. Some were from neighbors, some from people across the state, some from HOA victims who shared their own horror stories, their regrets, their helplessness. One stood out. It was handwritten shaky on paper that looked like it came from an old legal pad. Dear Mr. Langley, my name is Clarence Owens. I'm 83 years old. My HOA in Colorado Springs bulldozed my backyard greenhouse after I refused to take it down. I didn't have your fight in me. But reading your story gave me peace. I thought I'd gone soft, that I'd lost my dignity in silence. But seeing someone fight back with dignity intact reminded me that silence doesn't mean weakness. It just means we pick our moments. Thank you. Yours in quiet defiance, Clarence. I read it twice, then again. Then I sat back, swallowed the lump in my throat, and stared out the window at my orchard, the same trees Karen had once called an eyesore. They looked beautiful in the morning light. With the hearing over and the HOA defanged, I finally had breathing room to do something I'd been planning for months. Make the orchard public. Not commercial, not monetized. Just open. I went to the county registrar's office and filed paperwork to convert the orchard into a Community Trust Parcel, a rare but legal designation that allowed my land to remain private property while granting managed access to public groups for educational and agricultural purposes. The legal basis, a subsection of the Urban Agricultural Enrichment Act, which I'd helped pass 15 years ago. In other words, I was using the law, my own law, to give something back. I called it the Orchard Commons Project. Within 2 weeks, we had our first official event, Cider Day. Local vendors donated supplies. A few musicians set up under the Macintosh trees. Parents brought kids. Grandparents brought stories. We even had a little book table where people could leave behind messages, drawings, and photos tied to fruit farming or family. A reporter from a regional magazine came out, took pictures, asked me questions. I didn't say much, just this. And this place was never meant to be a battlefield. It was meant to feed people body and spirit. It still is. The article went viral too, not for the drama, but for the healing. What surprised me most was how many former HOA members reached out. One woman named Deanna wrote, "I was part of a board like Karen's once. We didn't know what we were doing. We thought rules made us important. We thought control was the same thing as safety. Thank you for showing us that wisdom is quiet, and power doesn't have to shout." Even the county officials, the same ones who had once sent me inspection notices and emails about zoning, showed up to volunteer. We built benches from reclaimed wood, put up a small barn swing, and laid out a gravel trail that wound through the rows with little plaques describing the trees. One plaque read, "This orchard withstood storms not of weather, but of will. Let it remind us that patience and truth, like trees, grow deeper the longer they're tested." It became a place for more than apples. It became a place for reconnection, for the veterans, for the kids, for the families who realized they'd let fear be louder than friendship. Even Kyle, the young HOA president, came by. He didn't say much at first, just helped carry crates from the barn, watered some seedlings, then sat with me under the northern spy trees. "I was wrong," he said eventually, "about everything." I nodded. That's how we learn. He looked down at the grass. "Karen still emails me. Still says I should have fought harder." I chuckled. "Tell her apples don't care about power struggles. They just want sun and water." We both laughed. That night, after everyone had gone home, I stayed out under the stars longer than usual. Scout lay curled beside me. The air smelled of cider, cinnamon, and autumn. I watched the leaves flutter under the moonlight and thought about how close I came to letting anger lead me, to losing the very peace I had come here for. But I hadn't, because I hadn't fought fire with fire. I'd fought it with roots, deep ones, the kind that hold. By early November, the orchard had taken on that golden rust-streaked beauty that only comes once a year when the last apples hang heavy on the trees and the air smells of wood smoke and leaves that have already given up. We had just finished harvesting the final rows when I got the call. It was Kyle. "Joe," he said, voice clipped, but respectful. "I thought you should hear it from me before it hits the paper." I sat down at my kitchen table, still dusted in soil from the morning's work. I'm listening. "She's suing the HOA," he said. I blinked. "Karen." "Yeah. Claims we violated her rights. When we voted her out, says she's been defamed, scapegoated, and get this, unjustly vilified by a rogue civilian manipulating the neighborhood with state-level intimidation tactics." It took me a moment to respond. "I suppose that makes me the rogue civilian." He chuckled. "You and your apples, apparently." The lawsuit wasn't going to go anywhere. It was frivolous, built on sand and ego, and Kyle knew it. But he still sounded nervous. I could tell he feared it might stir up trouble again, reignite the war. I told him what I meant to tell everyone. Let her do what she needs to do. The truth is documented. The people have spoken. But the lawsuit didn't go viral like her flyers did. It fizzled. In fact, it backfired. Because during her court filings, new information came out, including HOA board emails, voice recordings, and internal notes that painted a clear picture of long-term manipulation, targeted harassment, and what the press would later call suburban vigilantism masquerading as community service. The local newspaper ran a Sunday headline that read, "Valley Glen's former HOA vice president under investigation for abuse of power. False reports." The article quoted portions of Karen's own correspondence, some of which I'd never seen before. "And we can bury him in paperwork. Once he's seen as a risk, even the school board will have to step away." He needs to be removed even if we have to bend interpretation. Bend interpretation. That phrase echoed in my head for days. In the weeks that followed, the investigation widened. Turns out Karen hadn't just gone after me. She'd filed anonymous complaints against at least 5 other residents, including a mother who ran a daycare out of her home, an older couple who kept chickens behind a privacy fence, and even a disabled vet who used a shed for metalwork therapy. Each time she'd justified her actions by citing community integrity. Each time she'd masked control as care. The fallout was swift. Karen was officially banned from holding any HOA office in the county ever again. The board issued a public apology, not just to me, but to the neighborhood. They posted a statement on their website, mailed hard copies to every home, and sent an open letter to the county clerk affirming their acknowledgement of gross overreach by the previous leadership. To my surprise, the apology was genuine, humble even. And in it they wrote, "We allowed a culture of compliance to become a substitute for compassion. We forgot that a neighborhood is not a brand, it's a body of people with roots differences and the right to peace." That line stayed with me. Karen, of course, didn't disappear. She moved 2 towns over last I heard, bought a new condo in a gated community. Word was she tried to get onto that HOA's board too, but her name was already known. Her reputation preceded her. She was quietly declined. The predator had been declawed. And for the first time in a long while, Valley Glen began to feel like a place again. Not just a set of homes and hedges, but a living, breathing community. With voices, with choice. People planted more flowers. Kids played outside longer. Even the tone of the neighborhood Facebook page, once a den of anonymous complaints and passive-aggressive scolding, shifted. More birthdays, more lost and found pets, more kindness. A month later, I was invited to speak at the town's annual Civic Engagement Forum. A strange honor for a retired ag guy who still wore the same boots every day. But I accepted. The event was held in the town library. Fold-out chairs, warm cider old carpet. I walked up to the podium and looked at the faces before me, not just my neighbors, but people from across the county. Some had tears in their eyes. Some had arms crossed with curiosity. Most just looked tired of being told they didn't matter. I kept it simple. I didn't come here to stir up trouble, I began. I came here to grow apples, that's all. But when someone tried to tear that down, I didn't fight with fists or fire. I fought with patience, with paper, with roots. I paused, then said the only thing that mattered. You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You just have to stand long enough that the storm tires itself out. The room was silent. Then applause. And not the polite kind. The real kind. When I left that night, the air was sharp with winter. The sky was heavy with stars. I walked to my truck with my shoulders back and my breath steady. And for the first time since the very first letter from the HOA had landed in my mailbox, I felt a new kind of quiet settle in me. Not silence. Peace. The kind that grows from truth. The kind that no one, not even a Karen with a clipboard, can ever uproot again. The frost came early that year. By the end of November, the orchard had gone still, not dead, just resting. The leaves had fallen, the branches lay bare, and the scent of apples had been replaced by something quieter. Wood smoke turned earth, the faint sweetness of cider aging in barrels out back. And with that stillness came something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not just relief, but completion. Everything Karen had thrown at me was gone now. Her flyers, her accusations, her cameras, her calls to the police, her smug sidewalk glares, all faded into the past like the last harvest of the season. In their place stood a stronger truth, a community, a space that no longer bowed to fear. The Orchard Commons project had become more than I ever imagined. What started as an act of quiet resistance had turned into something bigger. That December, we hosted our first Winter Lantern Walk. Dozens of families came out in scarves and gloves, carrying handmade lanterns down the gravel paths between the trees. Kids laughed and stomped through brittle leaves, while parents sipped warm cider and watched as we lit up the orchard with soft golden light. There were no speeches, no ceremony. Just people connected again, under the stars, standing on the same land that once divided them. I stood near the barn watching it all. Kyle passed by and handed me a thermos. "You did something here," he said. "Something none of us could have." I shook my head. "No." "We did. You just had to learn the hard way." He smiled, and for once I saw in him what I had once feared. He lacked humility. And just like that, it felt like the final stone had been laid. But there was one last thing I needed to do. I went home that night and pulled out the thick file I had kept throughout the ordeal, every HOA letter, every legal document, every screenshot, every photo of Karen standing on the edge of my land, daring me to flinch. I didn't want to burn it. I didn't want to throw it away either. So I drove out to the local historical society the next morning and I handed it over. Community preservation, I told them. The archivist smiled. You sure about this? Absolutely. I want future boards to read what happens when the rules forget the people they're meant to serve. She took it from me with a nod, and just like that, I let it go. Winter rolled on. The orchard went quiet again, resting in its rightful dormancy. I spent the cold months fixing the barn roof, tightening old irrigation valves, reading books I'd left half-finished for years. Sometimes neighbors would stop by to drop off baked goods or leave thank you cards in the mailbox. I never asked for that, but I accepted it with grace. Scout, my old dog, had taken to sleeping longer. He was getting slower, more deliberate. Some mornings, he'd lie in the sun near the porch, nose twitching, tail thudding gently when I walked by. One morning, a little girl from the neighborhood, Molly, maybe 6 or 7, walked up with her dad. She handed me a crayon drawing of the orchard. In it, I was standing under a tree, smiling. My dog sat next to me. Above, in big block letters, she'd written, Mr. Joe's Peace Garden. Her dad smiled sheepishly. She insisted. I knelt down, looked her in the eyes, and said, That's the nicest name I've ever heard. I framed that drawing, hung it in the barn. A month later, I was invited to speak again, this time at a statewide gathering of HOA reform advocates. Lawyers, lawmakers, homeowners, reporters. People who'd heard the story and wanted to make sure it didn't become just another internet flashpoint. They asked me to help draft a new bill, one that would limit HOA oversight boundaries, mandate transparency, and include protections for independent, adjacent landowners. I didn't say yes right away. I took a week to think. Then I drove back to the hill behind my orchard, the same one I used to walk with Sandra when she was still alive. I sat on that old log where we'd once watched storms roll in, and I closed my eyes. I could almost hear her. If you've still got breath in your lungs, Joe, you've got work left to do. So I said yes. But I also made one thing clear. I wasn't fighting anymore. I was planting something that would outlast me. Truth, roots, resilience. That spring, we planted 20 new trees, half apple, half plum, in the eastern field. Local kids helped. Miss Alston brought her class. Even Kyle showed up with a shovel and blistered his palm on the first dig. I watched them work with the kind of quiet joy I hadn't felt in years. No one asked for permission. No one checked a rule book. No one filed a complaint. They just dug, just grew. And I knew then the story wasn't about me anymore. It was about them and the soil we'd protected. So if anyone ever asks me how I beat the HOA, I'll tell them I didn't. Not really. I just stood still long enough and let the truth bloom around me, like apples, like peace, like the kind of justice that doesn't need to raise its voice because it's already rooted deep in the land we love.